We've all done it. Remove mouse. Yeah.
Okay, looks like it's rolling. Right. So yeah, if I'd known we'd have such a great turnout, I would have probably gotten a larger room. But anyway, I'm really glad that all the four parties are here represented. So that's really great for Stop Spraying New Brunswick. So I'll just do a quick introduction. So on behalf of Stop Spraying New Brunswick, I welcome and thank you for attending this public forum to draft a model motion. Yeah, if it gets too hot. To draft a model motion to stop the spraying of glyphosate and other herbicides on public land in New Brunswick. We invited the current political parties that have elected people that will be in the legislature, so happy to see all the parties represented. My name is Dr. Carolyn Lugodarcy. I'm the chair of Stop Spraying New Brunswick. And I would like to introduce our moderator, Chris Collins. He has been so nice as to offer to moderate. We asked him, but he agreed to do it, to moderate this meeting. And we also invited some experts and resources to come and help answer questions. And I see that Tim LeBlanc is here from the Department of Environment. Charles Theriault is here, who has, of course, created a very extensive documentary on forestry in New Brunswick, so he has a lot of knowledge on the issue. And then we've also invited a retired New Brunswick chief deer biologist, Cumberland, to come and so he can give his technical expertise as well. And we invited media, and I see that there is some media here, so that's really great to see as well. First things first, I would like to start maybe here with David Coon, because he's the first one on this side. If we can go around and just everybody introduce themselves and which riding they represent and which political party they're with. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carolyn. David Coon, leader of the Green Party and MLA for Fredericton South. This riding right here.
Okay. Andrew Harvey, I'm the MLA for Carl Victoria, a Liberal and Minister of Environment, Local Government.
Ross Wetmore from the village of Gagetown. I'm riding this Gagetown Petticoatiac, and I'm a PC member.
Mike Holland, PC MLA for the Albert riding.
Sterling Wright, the Executive Director of People's Alliance.
Michelle Conroy, MLA, Marishi, People's Alliance.
DeSaulniers, Fredericton, York, People's Alliance. I live in Fredericton.
Can you repeat your name? Sorry.
DeSaulniers.
S-A-U?
Capital S, A-U-L, N-I-E-R-S.
I just have one small item. Sterling, you're not an elected MLA, so we've asked all the people who are not elected MLAs to sit along the side, please. Thank you.
Why don't we give those chairs to
So I guess I'll hand it over to Chris now to continue.
Thank you very much. I'm
take those chairs.
going to be doing an unbiased job. I really haven't taken a position on this. I'm very, I have worked on cosmetic pesticides a lot. I have secured a ban on 230 chemicals in 2009. But I'm going to do an unbiased job in moderating this. But I would also want to give the opportunity, there's some groups in the room that are represented here today. If they could stand up and introduce themselves and which group that they're representing, it'd be great, because then we have a better source of our knowledge base in this room. So if you, does anybody?
We're media, New Brunswick Media Co-op. Myself
Okay.
and photographer Brian Beaton. I'm Susan O'Donnell.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Mike Leger with Forest New Brunswick.
Okay.
Josiane Val, I'm CEO with the Agricultural Alliance of New Brunswick.
I'm Tim Wall with the Department of Environment.
Okay, very good.
Kathy Brewer-Dalton with the Department of Agriculture, Aquaculture, and Fisheries.
Anyone else? Thank you very much. Now, I was asked to, I think this is both to stimulate conversation and also to give you a kind of a framework on where this group wants to go with regards to changes to the regulations. So I'm just going to read to you a draft. And it reads, The Lieutenant Governor and Council makes the following regulation citation. This regulation may be cited as a prohibition against spraying of glyphosate and similar herbicides on public lands. The province will no longer compensate vendors for, number 2, the province will no longer compensate vendors for the application of glyphosate or similar herbicides in the forest industry. 3, no licenses will be issued by the province of New Brunswick for the application of glyphosate or similar herbicides on public lands in New Brunswick, including crown lands, public right-of-ways, watersheds, and other public properties. 4, the public health officer will conduct a thorough review of the findings of recent legal actions and other prohibitions in other jurisdictions in order to provide a report on the applicability of the precautionary principle in banning all use of glyphosate and similar herbicides in New Brunswick. Number 5, a person who violates or fails to comply with Section 3 commits an offense punishable under Part 2 of the Provincial Offences Procedure Act as a category offense. It's a category something offense. Commencement. This regulation we come into force on November 1st, 2018. I think that'll have to be flexible. So I'm just going to open it up to discussion. So just if you could just give me a wave, and I will entertain discussion from the groups, not just the politicians here today, because this is a public meeting, and we'll take public input. As well, try to keep your comments brief, so everybody has a chance to speak. Who wants to start it off?
I'll start it off.
Mr. Coon just gave me a nod, so I'll recognize Mr. Coon first.
You know, it's a question about the form, first of all, I guess, and that is, I don't recall a motion. So it's a question of whether we can make a motion that, a debatable motion that is directed at Lieutenant Governor and Council to make a regulation. I don't know if that's true, but we probably need to know whether that's true. There's no clerks here to ask.
Right.
So it is a question.
It's not legislation. These are regulatory changes that would take place as an order in council.
I understand.
There are some changes that may need to be taking place, as I can see it from in number 5 in legislation to parallel with that. So, did you have anything further, Mr.
No, it's just something to check.
Please.
Yes, thank you. So the proposed resolution here, change to regulation, is predicated on the fact that we have enough well-established evidence to actually put this forward. My understanding is, and this is from our perspective from the forest sector, that the evidence isn't there to take this type of a position.
I think in there they refer to the precautionary principle.
Correct.
So that overrides the need for dead evidence on it. I understand your concern, but unless you want to change that from the precautionary principle to something else.
Can we clarify the definition of precautionary principle to make sure we have a common understanding of that?
Is anybody prepared to do that in here today? Precautionary principle is a very vague term.
I can quickly Google it.
Well, we need some sort of authoritative definition that we could all agree to on precautionary principle before I think we could entertain this. I mean, no problem discussing it, but I'd just like to have some clarification on that.
And can you repeat your name?
Mike Leger with Forest New Brunswick Forest Products Association.
Well, I can read out to you the definition. And generally, it defines actions on issues considered to be uncertain, for instance, applied in assessing risk management. The principle is used by policymakers to justify discretionary decisions in situations where there is the possibility of harm from making a certain decision, when extensive scientific knowledge on the matter is lacking. The principle implies that there is a social responsibility to protect the public from exposure to harm when scientific investigation has found a plausible risk. These protections can be relaxed only if further scientific findings emerge to provide sound evidence that no harm will result.
Will everybody accept that as a definition of precautionary principle?
I'm not going to accept something that was Googled up, but I mean, I'm listening to the definition. I think we'd want to go back and take a look.
Giving us a democratic opportunity here. So does everybody accept that as the definition? So we'll go off that definition?
I do.
The Department of Environment does have the precautionary principle in their, I've seen it in their act. So, I presume that the Department of Environment knows what the precautionary principle is.
Moving forward, any further discussion on this? Any recommendations for deletion or additions? Understood, I had heard somebody might want to make a recommendation to leverage the Clary report to be brought forward as part of this.
I hate to nitpick, but when you say similar herbicides, are you talking about molecularly similar, or are you talking about similar in how it
Similar action.
action, not molecular?
No, similar action.
Mr. Coon?
Yeah, thank you. Just wondering if there's some rationale for number 4 specifically. That could be explained.
I think it's because of the recent legal, things that have been happening across the world. There have been some outcomes, some judgments and things like that. So it's related to that. That there's been definitely new findings in the past year that have caused the judgment to happen. And, we would like the public health officer to look at that.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Leader.
To that point, I don't know if the public health officer is necessarily qualified to render an opinion on a legal decision. I'm not arguing the point, I just don't see the public health officer being the go-to person for that.
So perhaps we should reword that to clearly define that the information contained in the legal decision is scientific, that the health officer should be able to consider the scientific evidence that is in the legal decision.
Yes.
Okay. I think that was the intent, but thanks for the clarification on that. Mr. Coon.
I guess to continue on with number 4 there, it looks like this is directed at all uses of glyphosate, so it would be agricultural and
Well, no, our mandate is all about public land, so that's all we're talking about.
Okay, well, okay, so number 4 is unclear because it says report on the applicability of the precautionary principle in banning all use of glyphosates and similar herbicides in New Brunswick.
So we could reword that to on public land in New Brunswick.
I think it's important to be clear that way.
Yeah.
Can you give a definition of public land?
Not your yard.
No.
Well, it's Crown Forest, MB Power right-of-ways, CN Rail is I think our public pieces of land, and then of course there's base Gagetown as well.
So publicly owned or publicly managed or public?
No, publicly owned, Crown land is publicly owned land. It's not owned by any individual or any company.
Yes.
Just make it clarity, I think a lot of MB Power's right-of-way is they have a right-of-way, it's still private land, it's not Crown land. So
Yeah, well,
that's whatever your intent is,
Yeah, well, we are opposed to the spraying on MB Power land, so if you need to word it differently, that's okay with us.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask for clarification? When we say crown lands, there is also agricultural implications such as the maple syrup and blueberry sector. Is that included in the definition or is that excluded?
We are really only interested in forestry. We're not talking about agriculture at all, of any kind.
There is a crossover, I can understand this conversation, there's a crossover between forestry and agriculture when it comes to maple syrup.
Maple syrup is conducted in forests.
Right.
Right.
So it's an agricultural product that's done in forests, so maybe we should have a clarification there.
Well, I don't think I'm really equipped to answer the question, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
So that's, further discussion is needed on the definition there. That's a good point.
Base Gagetown, I don't know, I'm not sure that the legislature of New Brunswick would have the authority to make a decision on behalf of the federal government.
As far as I know, doesn't the provincial department issue the permits though for the spraying?
We do. That is there is a legal argument there that needs to be sorted out, who has the jurisdiction there. There is limitations on what we can require provincially on federally owned land when it's designated federally for a specific purpose.
Yeah. So if it turns out that all these applications have very different aspects to it, you know, for us the forestry aspect of it is probably the thing that we really want to talk about. So that's our, you know, that would be the main thing, if it needs to be separated out, I would think. I'm just going to make sure that my camera is working.
So what you're saying is the licenses are given for spraying in Gagetown, on Gagetown land or Canadian Forces base land out of courtesy.
The contractor applies for permits and receives permits.
Okay.
But we've never had an issue that we had to enforce a condition, and whether we run into obstacles there, I'm not sure. It's possible.
So I have another question. I have many questions, but so you're saying public land, forestry, now that's forestry land, is that correct? I'm just trying to.
Yeah, but we're talking about crown land.
Well, I know, I just need to know what you're talking about. So you're talking about crown land, you're not talking about private forest land? Okay. Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I would just like to have some distinct clarification on this, because we're talking about crown land, but now we're suggesting we're excluding maple sugaries, we're excluding blueberry, we're excluding agricultural connections to forest land. Let's call a spade and say this is a ban on herbicide use on the ground forest. I mean, if that's what it is, let's put it up there and see.
Well, it is. But the thing is, our issue also is MB Power, so that's why we've tended to use, you know, the words public land, because we are also opposed to the spraying that MB Power does. However, we need to put them together. Those are probably the two big things that our supporters are, you know, and that's been our mandate from the beginning. But it's been about crown forest land, definitely.
And you're also against spraying in Canadian Forces base, Gagetown, correct?
Well, a lot of our supporters are concerned about it as well. Yeah.
Okay, so what you can say is that you can put that in with the rider where applicable. If they can do, you can. I mean, this is something they're putting together as a fundamental attempt. You know, government isn't without influence, so. Perhaps that suggestion could be made to government as well. And if it can't be done, it can't be done. But it'll put pressure on the rest. Further comments, input? Anything that you'd like to see added to this?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
number 4 again. It specifically refers back to our public health officer. Is there, but I don't see any relations back to PMRA, which is our national body, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency,
Right.
and that's their role. I'm just curious to see as why they're not stated in this statement.
The reason why we haven't mentioned that is that this is a decision that forest spraying and power spraying is regulated by the province of New Brunswick. It is not regulated by the federal Department of Health or anything. Or the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, sure, can decide that something is fine to use. Our argument is that the use of this herbicide on our forest land is causing a whole bunch of problems, and we're not isolating the health concern, which is what the PMRA only looks at. For the use, in New Brunswick, our main use of glyphosate is in forests, in forestry. 61% of all glyphosate use is in forestry. And what the public is saying, our supporters who have signed this petition, are saying that we want this practice stopped. We're not going to wait for our health department to make a decision that it's not safe for our health. We know it's not good for our biodiversity. We know it's not good for our wildlife. We're losing our deer. People are losing their way of life as a result of what's going on in the forests. And we want our provincial government to decide what's best for us. We don't want our provincial government to just say, well, we're passing the buck to Health Canada and to the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. That is our point, our standpoint. I don't know how to keep this thing going to sleep.
Mr. Chair.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think this doesn't nearly go far enough. I mean, this product has been banned in almost every jurisdiction in the world globally. I wonder why we're having this discussion even. It's an appalling product, and it should be banned totally in the province. Not just, forestry, everywhere. Every jurisdiction that I've looked at has banned it. Oh, why are we even having this discussion? It's a poison.
Perhaps the reason for the discussion is to move it towards that if the governments want to do that, so that they can join those jurisdictions.
And do you think we're moving in that direction? Is this meeting moving it forward?
That's not a question for me. I'm just recognizing who gets to speak.
Well, I don't hear any of the public representatives speak. Apart from Mr. Coon, I haven't heard any of the public representatives speaking, saying too much on it. Could we hear something from the other public representatives?
We can go around the table at the end. And if they want to say something, that's fine. If not, then that's their option as well. I'm not going to force people to talk today. And I think, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, for clarity, I'm not aware of any jurisdiction in North America or Europe that has outright banned the use of glyphosate.
That's not true.
I'm not aware of any.
Well, I can't think of any. Well, I certainly have read of ones that have. I can't remember which particular ones, but it's certainly been banned in some jurisdictions.
I think we should bring some sources forward if we're going to make that type of statement.
Yeah, I don't think we want to get into that discussion today, if you don't mind. We organized this meeting, and our concern is focused on what we've decided it's, for us, is the issue, and that is what we would like to have this discussion around. And I also need to counter that no, actually glyphosate has not been banned in a lot of jurisdictions. It's been limited in certain formulations in some places, but there are actually very few countries that have outright banned it. So that is not really the discussion today.
Now, what do you mean limited in certain formulations?
Well, depending on what it's mixed up with, because the adjuvants have an effect as well. We are not targeting like a lot of those issues because New Brunswick is so different from the rest of the world, and our own Chief Medical Officer's report confirmed that in New Brunswick, the main use of glyphosate is in forestry, 61%. 11% is in agriculture. In most places around the world, it's different. It's 90% in agriculture, so it's a very different use. This is a different use of this herbicide, and it's used on our forests, and we wanted to stop. And this meeting was organized to work on that, and not to try to expand it to more aspects of it.
Okay. Well, a poison is a poison.
Mr. Leger?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to discuss this proposal in the context we've been given, Mr. Chair. I could spend all day countering what Ms. Lubadersi's arguments are. Yes, herbicide is used predominantly in New Brunswick from a forestry basis. What is not spoken of, again, I'll agree with Ms. Lubadersi, we don't have the format or the time here to get into this discussion. But it is used so sparingly in this province. A third of 1% of the province is sprayed with this herbicide once every 40 to 50 to 60 years, depending on the regeneration of the forest. It's very, very minor. So, I'm more than happy to look at this as a hypothetical situation where we may present this as a motion, but it's very difficult given the context of the belief around
Excuse me, but
the use of the
we
herbicide.
invited elected officials to discuss this motion. We didn't really invite industry to come and comment on this.
Well,
And actually, we do have some other people here. We have brought Cumberland, who's an expert as well, and Charles Theriault, and I would like to hear their points of view as well.
Absolutely. They only have to raise their hand.
And I thought that, as moderated, I understood that it was a public meeting, so I was going to allow for public input.
Sure, but we don't
So-
want the
so
whole
I
meeting to
appreciate
be
your
about,
input.
you know,
But-
one particular.
And that's understood. So, yeah, let's try to get around the two other individuals here, Charles and Bob.
I live in a wooded area. I live in a forest community, Keswick, New Brunswick. The biggest issue home is, of course, spraying, because we have people who work in the forest, we have people who plant trees, and the majority of the income comes from living within the forest. People who work in the mills, people who work in the maple industry. And we have seen a severe decline in animal life, in deer. We've seen a major increase in cancer. And although we're all talking about there's a link to our health here and that link to the health of the animals, we at home are convinced that this thing needs to be banned. We're also convinced that it could also help increase even work for people into the silviculture. We think that spraying helps the concept of building tree farms and working with providing and doing clear cuts. And we all know what clear cuts are doing. If I went around home and polled and said, we need selective cutting, and they would all go, yes, that's the route to go. And we would go. And they would say, and we would do thinning. And that's more of a holistic approach, allowing the whole nature as itself to grow. Because what we're poisoning is we're poisoning a section of Mother Earth so companies can make, or the companies can make a profit. But at what cost? On long term, for what the whole of our area is, what are we paying? Well, we're paying, it's a major price as far as we're concerned, if it involves our health and if it involves the health of our forests. So I'm all for banning it completely, as much as Monsieur Lejade is for, maintaining a profit level for the companies he represents. But that's not putting into consideration the health of our families and the health of our forests, of which we live in. I can then list off 100 people who say they've been sprayed. And I can list 100 people who related the deaths of their family members to the fact that there's no proof to it yet. But people are impacted severely. And the fact that the deer population has crashed, not in Quebec, which we're bordered with, but home. That has to tell you something.
Yes, question?
Yes. What we're going to do is we're going to do this, and then we're going to go around the table.
Well, just to what his comments. I just had a
It's not an
question.
argument, okay?
Oh, no. Just to trying to hear to get information. Do you see, Charles, that you're still focused on public land and forest land, not private forest land? And I'm just a little confused what the rationale is for that argument. Because a forest is a forest. Trees,
Yes.
animals don't know where the crown land borders are, you know what I'm saying? So what's the rationale for that argument?
What do you mean?
Well, you're talking about banning glyphosate and other herbicides on forest public land,
Yes.
not private land.
Well, it's the first step, isn't it? And if
Well, no, I'm
this
just
says
trying
if right now government is paying for private spraying on private lands, right?
Okay.
But if basically this is saying government will stop spraying on public forests,
Okay.
and stop paying for it.
That's fair. No, it's fair comment. I just,
Yeah.
but the rationale that private landowners including woodlot owners that do it, private small woodlot owners, they can still continue to do it then?
If they paid for it.
Okay, so it's a money issue, it's not a health issue?
No, right now.
I'm trying to understand is all, I'm not trying to.
Can I interject? Charles Theriault is, we brought him here as someone who's very knowledgeable, but he's not the one who drew up our petition.
Well,
So
no.
Stop Spraying New Brunswick made
Yeah.
a decision to target Crown land because we think that let's start with the problem that is controlled by our government.
Okay, that's fair.
We don't want to tell
Yeah.
private people what to do. That's our
I'm not
reason.
trying to be confrontational, I'm just asking the question, the difference, private woods and public woods, because it's the same issues, so.
Mr. Coon?
Well, just a clarification, if you're spraying on private land, industrial freehold or whatever it is, you still have to, whoever's doing the spraying has to do, apply for a permit from the Department of Environment, local government under the, you're the minister, under the Pesticides Control Act.
Yeah.
So we are telling, with that, through the legislation, the permitting process, we are telling people whether they can or cannot spray a particular thing, right? Whether it's on Crown land or whether it's on industrial freehold or whether it's on some giant woodlot that someone has some money to spray.
Yeah, we also know that because we went through the Freedom of Information, we certainly saw that when you look at subsidization of the spray program, most of the money is going to spraying on Crown land. Actually, a very small portion goes to the private woodlot owners. So we know that they're not as big a factor as what's happening on Crown land.
Okay.
That's our
I
standpoint.
just had a question.
Did you want to make comments?
Sure. Yeah, the first comment I'd like to make is I'm not at all opposed to the forest industry whatsoever. My position is not to negatively impact the forest industry. My position is that we need to look at the science behind it. And the forest research that's been done on glyphosate is very clear. Glyphosate is intended to kill hardwoods. And we have a number of species in the province that utilize it. And to say that it has no impact, which the website currently does, is foolhardy. It doesn't reflect the science. It doesn't reflect the forestry-based science. My problem is with poor science. It always has been. Same as numbers, 1%. That's 15,000 hectares a year. We've been doing it for 30 years. If 15,000 hectares isn't a lot of land, I'd like to have a little bit of that. 15,000 hectares is a lot of property. And what we have access to but have never done is looked at where that's been done. So 15,000 hectares, if it's all in one spot, that's a problem. If it's spread out evenly all across the land base, maybe it's not such a problem. But during my 10 years as a deer biologist, I saw, if you want to know why Crown land versus private land, I would say because I did see during my 15 years that the deer that were on Crown land, we had vacant deer yards on Crown land everywhere. So the question is, why are those deer yards vacant? And I spent a considerable amount of my time, from taxpayers' time, trying to find that out. And that's where my concern comes from, because the deer, when we grew the deer herd in 2007, the deer herd we harvested 10,000 animals across the province. The majority of the harvest was on private land. So there was an issue on Crown land, and the question is why? And if you read the literature, we've always attributed the growth in deer from the early 1900s, when we had very few, to the boom we had in the 60s and 80s. We've always attributed that to the great abundance of hardwood browse that was created in small clear cuts. So if we in turn around and remove that same kind of browse that we've given credit for increasing the deer herd, why would we think it is not going to cause a negative impact? Again, it flies in the face of science. So 15,000 hectares, and I think it's up to 18,000 right now over 30 years. I would propose to you, based on what I've seen in my experience, it has had an impact. An animal that eats hardwood browse almost exclusively, different times of the year, it has got to have an impact on those animals. I'm not saying it's killing the animals, because typically, anybody in the room that hunts knows that if you spray a cut, they are not there any longer. The animals move. They need to go, but there's enough food available so that they can maintain themselves and then the offspring that they have. So there has to be a certain amount of hardwood browse available. And we know from measuring twigs and weighing them that they basically on an acre of ground you can produce enough food for it to maintain a deer for the entire year. So if you spray 15,000 hectares, that's enough food for 15,000 deer. And we've been removing that much for 30 years.
Could you repeat that? that number?
15,000. Basically, if you weigh the twigs, the amount of Harvey browse available in the cut, basically a cut can produce, if you look at the numbers from the science, it can produce enough hardwood twigs to basically make a 1 ton of food.
1 hectare.
One acre.
One
That's
acre.
an acre. Because we're talking hectares here, right? That's over 30,000 animals, right? Thanks for clarifying that, because you're right, hectares and acres, it's acres.
Yeah, it's
So a
acres.
ton of food per acre.
Per acre.
And that's what a deer would roughly consume. If you weigh it out, deer eats 2 to 10
Yeah.
pounds of food a day, so it's basically that much over, so it's enough for 32,000 deer in a year, and that's conservative. All these numbers are all conservative. But again, if we're gonna talk about the issue, let's put real facts on the table and look at what the implications are. I mean, again, I don't have a problem with forest industry whatsoever, but to say that spraying glyphosate is beneficial to deer is not accurate, because you're removing deer food. It can't be beneficial for deer.
Mr. Leger, one more comment, and then we're going to go to the table of elected officials.
Thank you,
I'm
Mr.
not sworn in.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cumberland's point, the facts are important, the numbers are important. 15,000 hectares sprayed annually, he says it's a lot. Put it in the context of 6 million hectares of working forest that we have in the province. It's not a lot in that context. His hypothesis is interesting, and I'd say at face value, you'd say, yeah, that does make some sense, that if you're spraying and you're reducing the browse for the deer, that would seem reasonable, that it would have an impact on deer populations. But you have to reverse engineer that. What about the 2/3 that are harvested and not sprayed, grow back naturally? There is more than copious amount of browse there, I would think, to support the deer population and increase it. So there's a current study being done to look at the hypothesis. Is forest operations having an impact? Can you make a strong correlation between that? If yes, then we have to fix it. But let's wait to the results from that research before we jump to conclusions.
Again, we're talking precautionary principle. It was accepted earlier in the meeting. We don't have to wait for those principles to come in. We have to act on a precautionary principle, which says that until such time as it's unequivocally proven to be wrong, that continues. Did you have any more points to make?
Just to follow up on that.
Well, I don't want to have an argument here.
No,
Just
something else that, because we plant, when we plant, and that's places that are sprayed is where we plant.
Right.
We plant crown land that has the highest site index. So it's the richest soil out there, because if you're going to invest in a tree in the ground, it grows best on rich soil. So we've been planting that, the richest soil in the province, for a long time. So it's not just crown land in general. We plant and spray the richest soil out there on crown land. So the other 2/3, I would say, let's measure it. Let's look at it, see how it grows. Because we know that the other stuff that isn't sprayed is either wet, ericaceous, rocky, high ground. It's something other than that, because the best ground is what's planted and sprayed. So I think that weighs a lot into that whole equation.
Can I ask a question?
No. So here's where we're at now, is we've just completed the section of the meeting where we've taken input from the public section of the meeting, and now we're going to move to go around the table where the people who are here that are elected officials can express their position on this particular working paper. Mr. Coon.
Sure. So, last sitting, I drafted a resolution around, on this topic that was a little more focused. They didn't get to the floor because I didn't have a seconder. That won't be a problem this time. But I say that because I feel like this needs to be focused down a little more. There's a lot of pieces to it, and I think it could be sharpened up. That's my main comment.
Okay, do you want to elaborate on that? Or,
Well, it seems like it's trying to address a number of things here that are overlapping, and I think that it could be edited in a way that would make it a little more focused and still capture the intent here.
Thank you for your input. I guess for more of a concise item. Mr. Harvey.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the invite to the group. I still have one question and a comment. Can I ask the question?
No. We're off this public section of the meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask the question of the day. There's lots of questions, obviously, in terms of wildlife, and I'm not an expert on it. I think there are lots of good input. There's lots of people in New Brunswick that probably could come together on this and find common ground, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I know Rod and I know Charles, and I wasn't trying to be confrontational with Charles. I was just asking a question about the scope of this, right? Because the scope is important as we move forward, whether it's here on the floor of the Legislative Assembly. I can make one comment and then someday Rod can react to it. I know we're doing a fair amount of strip cutting on Crown land or all land now. I see it a lot in my area with the hybrid bridges. There's a fair amount of strip cutting. So that 30-meter section is being harvested, and then that grows up, and you know. But that's all. I'm curious to see how that would, and that's not being sprayed. And I'm just curious to how that would come into the amount of food available for wildlife. And I don't have the answer to that. I just raising that point. So my point generally is there's a lot of concerns with this. Obviously, there's health concerns with the public. We all heard it when we were knocking on doors. Obviously, there's concerns with the ecosystem, the environment, the water tables, et cetera, et cetera. There's concerns with, from an industrial point of view or commercial point of view, of alternatives. What are the alternatives to a system that, if something is taken away or changed, what's the alternative? What's the cost? You know, what's the effectiveness? All these things have to come into play somewhat. I mean, you just can't, like that. Well, you could. I wouldn't advocate that, but you can't change the system overnight. Now, you can move towards it, making a firm decision to change it at some point with a phased-in period and looking at the alternatives. Because we still need to keep that in mind in the sense of the importance of the forest industry in New Brunswick to everyone. We have to look at manpower. It's a different world out there than when I grew up, or most of us grew up. I remember working in the woods myself, but you go to most of the young people I know when they're in the woods now in my area are working in maple sugars. They're not working in harvesting. So it's a different world. So whether manpower would be a critical component of that discussion moving forward, of whether, in terms of alternative types of silviculture, whether the manpower was there. I mean, that's a big issue. So all these things have to be taken into account, in my opinion, with a phased-in period. If it's the will of the Legislative Assembly at some point in the future, there has to be some phase-in period, looking at all the science, looking at not only the internal science but external science and everything, and people on the front line. People I'm sure in every riding in New Brunswick, every constituency, that have a gut feel and they have their own history and they have their own understanding of the forest, right? So those are a few points. The other point I wanted to make is we really have to be careful in whatever motion that the group here sends forward, there's got to be clarity. There has to be clarity with agriculture, in my opinion. Most of blueberry land is on Crown land, public land. So those all have to come into play. The maple industry, other food sources from the forest, how they come into play, organic production, et cetera, et cetera. Technology is another part of this. There is some technology now. I found this out the other day, that some small fruits are deemed organic, but they're still being sprayed. So, and I'm not an expert in all this stuff, but there's a technology, an evolution of technology that has to come into play here in terms of spraying. And I was just talking to a few potato farmers over the weekend, and they talk about glyphosate, and there's other more harmful herbicides than glyphosate. And that's what I'm told. I'm not an expert. I'm a politician. And I don't pretend to be an expert on this. But, so we gotta be careful that we don't replace something that's been developed as cost-effective and least harmful, maybe, with other herbicides that are more harmful. So if the focus is, if it's a narrow focus just on glyphosate, then we have to be careful on that too. So there's a bunch of things that, I think if the group wants to sharpen their motion and
Well, can I interject? Because it's clearly stated there, it says glyphosate or similar herbicides. We don't want it replaced with anything else. We want this to stop. And I mean, part of it is that we also know that economically, New Brunswick is not gaining anything from the practices right now. You know, we're paying the companies to spray, and we're not gaining anything from this, what's going on here. So, you know.
That's fine, and so I'll summarize.
It just isn't really fair to try to weave something into what we're about, you know.
Well, I'm not.
Before,
but I'll, in conclusion.
Yeah.
So in conclusion, I think everybody comes to this from the right area. And I come to it as a layman from Florence to Bristol and Juniper that grew up in the forest, hunted, and I understand those concerns. And I understand. I drove by a sugary the other day, and there was an area that was sprayed right next to it, and the softwood are 10 feet high, and the hardwood are 10 feet high, and it was sprayed, probably about 10 years ago, so, or roughly. But, so anyway, having said that, I think I'll just turn it over to my colleagues. And they can.
Just one thing, you mentioned that it's important to get all the information, correct?
Yes.
And as moderator, I would say that that's probably a good thing. Would you agree to releasing the Clarity report?
To release it
for public use, so that we get the information that's out of that. It hasn't been released. It's a document that has a lot of scientific data in it with regards, and it's very relevant. So to be consistent with what you're saying, would you like to see that? Would you add that to your?
I will take that under advisement. I won't make a comment on today. I'm not here. I'm here to listen to. And with the group that invited us to come, but I'm not going to commit to that, something like that today. But the last thing I want to mention is, I think there's a forum or an avenue that needs to happen in the Legislative Assembly that needs to address. This is a big issue and it needs to be addressed with all the viewpoints coming into play, and that's where the decision has to be made at some point, right? Obviously. So now I'll just leave it at that in terms of
Wetmore.
Thank you.
my colleagues.
Thanks very much. And first off, I'd like to just say to Carolyn and the Stop Spraying New Brunswick, this is sort of, historic that you've got the four parties with elected members sitting around the table having a discussion on bringing a motion forward. I would like to say that, my colleague and I are here representing our caucus, and we do have to take this motion back and discuss it with our caucus members. So certainly we can't say one way or the other whether we support it or whether we don't. We certainly support the initiative of bringing this forward. As progressive conservatives, we see this as just one small intricate piece in us reviewing the Crown Lands and Forestry Act. So there's a number of things that are going to come into play. And I would think that if Stop Spraying New Brunswick thought that there was going to be an agreement today and to come forward with a motion, I think that's pretty aggressive. But, this is the first step in a good discussion.
Mr. Holland.
Thank you very much. I grew up in the Miramichi and now live in Albert County, so I'm no stranger to wooded areas. My family cut wood. I grew up with a chainsaw in my hand at a young age, and I started hunting in 1985. We've seen changes over the landscape in the last 30 or so years, and I got some interesting points that I've taken down here. There's a couple of suggestions as it relates to this. We're putting together some legislation now. I don't understand precautionary principle, just learned about it today, but we've got some questions that were raised from the floor as it relates to maple sugar and to berries, how this affects and whatnot. It'd be great to have some clarity on that so that the bill, and I think Mr. Coon indicated, you know, some legislative clarity on stuff like that. NB Power and the public versus private, you know, what legally are we allowed to do? If a power line goes through my property, do I have the ultimate say on that? And I mean, those are questions I don't have. Maybe there is some stuff that should get answered there. Mr. Legier made a point when we started that, you know, we have no evidence. I believe that the folks on the Stop Spraying side would argue that there is a ton of evidence, but precautionary principle requires us to move forward without exploring that. I love having evidence put on the table, even in this short conversation. You know, Mr. Cumberland and Mr. Theriault made some great points. Folks from the agriculture, there was folks that were contributing to the conversation that's not reflected in that particular motion. You know, we've got opponents, we've got proponents, and then we've got a legislative framework that we have to work within. So one of the things that I look at through this lens is through the course of the election campaign now and going forward, one of the things that we were excited about is that we've committed to disassembling and then reassembling that Crown Lands and Forestry Act, which precautionary principle is fine, but we are inviting everyone to the table, proponents, opponents. Unlike when the act was written in 1982, people from all the stakeholder groups can come to the table. You know, we've got, when I look through quickly, we've got Stop Spraying New Brunswick and industry, but we also have the New Brunswick Wildlife Federation. We need them at the table. Conservation Council, agriculture groups, Mike, the groups that you guys represent, so that evidence-based decisions are made. We're pretty excited about our platform commitment to do that and bring everybody to the table. Does it snap a finger and stop things on a dime? Not necessarily, but a thorough, deliberate, intentional process where, like never before, all groups are going to be invited to the table. We appreciate being invited here, and we're going to take this back. I got like 4 or 5 pages worth of notes to bring to our caucus, and I, as a rookie MLA, certainly appreciate the invitation, and I'm excited to work further on this. Thank you.
Ms. Conroy.
Same thing. We're new to it too. It is on our platform. We've talked about it. We weren't really, I thought this was more of an informational session. I didn't realize that we all had input at the same time. But same issues, just safety issue, ecosystem is a big thing, bees, how we've noticed a lack of birds and stuff in our areas too. Big question is the bees crisis in the world right now, is if that's, how that's affected. So yeah, there's lots of questions, and the same thing, bring it back to our caucus, and like I say, it's a platform commitment as well of ours too, so we'd like to face it too.
Mr. DeSaulniers.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn, for inviting us. I too grew up in New Brunswick, and I hunted, and I fished, I caught flies, I fished salmon, I canoed, I did all of that. Right? I love New Brunswick, and I love our land and our streams and all of that. And I think that when you're representing people, and you're representing public trust, and you're representing public safety, if there's a question in regards to the scientific evidence, and even if it's 50-50, I think, as an elected official, I have to err on the side of public safety. Our party has this in our platform for a reason. I agree with it, and I agree that it should be banned. But, having said that, I can't go so far as to commit our leader to anything today. I certainly take what we've learned and have a discussion with them. But I know in principle we will support at some point a motion in regards to that when we get there. And I kind of tend to agree with David a little bit. We may have to refocus this a bit, but we certainly support the spirit and the principle of this. However, we will reserve committing at this point.
So that concludes this meeting, this public meeting. I want to thank everybody for being here.
I just had one other question, sorry.
Oh.
I just was asking my vice chair, who sadly is abroad working right now. Do the people present agree with the main points of the draft? Is the other question that you would like to get an answer to.
So,
The main point being
The main
ban
points. So the main points, not maybe the nitty-gritty details, but the main points of the draft.
Having it stop.
So,
That they should move, I guess that you should move forward with this.
Let me say
in
this
some
about
version
that,
of this.
okay? We agree with it in principle, in spirit. However, I think we need to shape it a little bit, and I need our leader to help us do that.
Mr. Coon?
Yeah, well, I said it needed to be focused a bit more, so I'm still kind of caught, particularly on 4 and 5. We didn't talk about 5, but I mean, the points are good. I just don't know that they all belong in that motion the way they're written.
Mr. Harvey?
as is presented?
No, that we should move forward in developing this, generally that it's a, that the issue has to be addressed, and we need to move forward with this.
So the main
Well,
points,
that's not
not
what she
the
asked,
tiny
so what-
details.
What's that?
It's about, so in principle, do you agree with the main points? Not so much like David Coon and Rick DeSaulniers said, that obviously details need to be addressed, and there are some factors that haven't been thought about today. But in principle, do you agree with the gist of this motion?
Well, I think the motion needs more clarity for sure, and I can't agree to something that I don't know what the final, if it's just this here, then I have a lot of questions that have been raised about that. I think the spirit is good, the principle's fine, and all that, but that's not gonna cut it. At the end of the day, you need clarity, and I think over time, we can develop that clarity in New Brunswick, but that's where I would leave it for right now.
Well, again, I had mentioned that I'm going to be taking this with my colleague back to our other colleagues. But what I can say that as Progressive Conservatives, we're more than prepared to work with Carolyn and the other members that are here to try and find a way to move this forward.
Similar comments to Ross. Issues like proprietary principle are probably, we want to dig into that. We know that there's experts on all sides, and we're dying to have everybody at the table. Truth of the matter is, with the proper exploration, a motion may not be required, maybe a moot point. If the process that we're talking about unfolding of rewriting the Crown Lands and Forestry Act and allowing everybody to sit at the table and put the evidence on the table, then, one of the big concerns is that the issues against spraying have never made it to the table. We're talking about allowing that to happen, so, that the wording and all that is problematic, and we're continuing to sit at the table and can't wait to make that table bigger.